Do you believe your current warm-up routine is priming you for peak performance? Well, after watching this video, you might have to reconsider, because new research has shown that some of the most popular warm-up routines are not only ineffective, but actually slowing you down. Luckily, last week I came across this paper detailing a simple 5-minute routine that has very promising results, including improvements in running economy and lowering perceived effort. In other words, giving you the ability to run faster without getting tired. So let's cover what this warm-up routine is, if it applies to all running conditions, how does it stack up against other routines, and while we're on the topic of warm-ups, which ones can reduce our risk of injury? Sports scientists have focused on warm-ups for a long time, and the proposed effects of the warm-up include aiding muscle and joint mobility, enhancing metabolic and nerve conduction rates, increasing blood flow and oxygen consumption, and psychologically preparing you for the task ahead. But unfortunately, these effects that are proposed are for the general athletic population. But recreational running is quite unique. For example, it's not uncommon within a week of training to do some short recovery runs and 20 to 40 minute tempo runs and really fast yet short efforts like strides and hill sprints, and then finishing off your week with a weekend long run. Just looking at this typical schedule, it's pretty obvious that all of these sessions require your body to work differently and therefore require different levels of preparation. So in my attempt to simplify things, I've broken up my warm-up advice into these categories. Let's start off with your longer run that goes up to and beyond 60 minutes. The authors of this paper put 10 runners through 5 static stretches, which is just a stretch and hold type of stretch, and consisting of 4 sets of 30 seconds. They included static stretches of the hamstring, calf, hip flexor, quadricep, and glutes. The runners then did a 30-minute treadmill run at 65% of their VO2 max, which, if you're unfamiliar, is pretty easy. They then immediately transitioned into a performance run. And with the researchers obstructing the treadmill display, they were asked to cover as much distance as possible in 30 minutes. And as you can see from the results, when the runners didn't stretch, they actually covered more distance. The paper said the results show that static stretching may impair endurance performance up to 60 minutes. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any other papers testing different warm-ups routines covering this specific distance, but it does make sense that the warm-up routine becomes less relevant the longer the duration. This is because the performance in long-distance events relies on factors such as VO2 max, lactate threshold, and biomechanical factors, instead of explosive, power-orientated movements, which stretching seems to accommodate. So if there is any debate moving forward, it seems to be not whether these static stretches are effective, but whether stretching decreases running economy or simply has no effect whatsoever. And you can apply this same logic to any of your easy or sub-maximal runs. And the theory holds true with this paper, showing static stretching and dynamic stretching doesn't seem to change running economy compared to no stretching when running at slower speeds. The results do get more interesting for faster running. I'll get to that in a second. But while these results aren't promising for performance or making running feel easier, perhaps stretching before easy runs might reduce your risk of injury. And this theory might have some merit because research like this does suggest that static stretching may be beneficial for injury prevention. But before you go away and continue your stretching routine, this paper elaborates on its benefits in sports with a sprint running component, but not in endurance-based running activities. This is also the conclusion of Baxter's paper, suggesting that stretching has no impact on the risk of chronic injury in endurance runners. But why is the research failing to find this link? Well, if we compare runners to, say, a gymnast or a dancer, you can see that the body doesn't really go through a large range of movement. And if we compare it to team sports or other sports events, you can see that a high degree of power isn't required. So in other words, the proposed benefits of stretching won't carry over to meet the requirements of endurance running. Plus, we know through research that runners aren't getting injured because they're inflexible. Instead, it's due to training errors or overloading your body too abruptly. But while it's not looking great for stretching at this point, we do need to recognize that everyone is different with different movement paths and mechanics. For example, some runners may be so stiff they can't complete a fluent running action even when running at slow speeds. And if you think this is you, my guess is it's not necessarily muscle tightness, but rather joint stiffness. So if you fall within this small demographic, you might benefit from joint mobility exercises before your run, which are based on continuous joint movement rather than static muscle stretching. So trial doing some exercises that mobilize the lower back, the ankles, and the hips and knees. Okay, so let me summarize my advice for your slower and longer runs. The research suggests that stretching doesn't help with performance or reduce your risk of injury. But we do know that some runners feel great after going through a warm-up routine. So first, conduct a few experiments, testing out different routines such as static stretches, dynamic stretches, and mobility exercises. Next, compare these with easy runs without a warm-up and look for any noticeable differences. Aim for 1 to 2 sets of 15 seconds for each muscle group to start. If you notice an improvement with a certain type of warm-up, then double down on it and see if doing it more enhances the benefits. Once you see a plateau in the benefits, the next step is to weigh up the benefit to time ratio. For example, if I needed to stretch for 10 minutes to experience a very small benefit, I'd say it's probably not worth it and I'd probably continue my easy runs without a warm-up routine. Because again, it won't be helping my running economy or reduce my risk of injuries, and I'm only doing these experiments to test out how it makes me feel. That's it. But here is where the research gets really interesting, because we're getting into the shorter, faster stuff. I couldn't find any research on static stretching, but check out this paper, which took 7 runners and had them do 5 dynamic stretches, doing 1 set of 10 on each side for each exercise, targeting muscle groups like the hip flexors, the hip extensors, leg extensors, leg flexors, and plantar flexors. They were asked to carry out the stretch as quickly and powerfully as possible without bouncing, and the whole routine took about 3.5 minutes. The subjects then did a time to exhaustion test, where they held a running speed equivalent to 90% of their VO2 max for as long as they could. And they found significant benefits in the dynamic stretching group. In fact, they ran more than 2 minutes longer on average. In their conclusion, the authors said that these findings suggest that dynamic stretching might improve race times in the 3 to 5k range. And while we're on the topic of faster 5k races, I thought I'd share a special warm-up tip from my podcast guest, Owen Everard, who is a sub 14 minute 5Ker. And his warm-up recommendation to run faster was this.
When I warm up, I would do a 30-second stride about 10 minutes out at race pace. Essentially, there's a thing called VO2 kinetics. People who had gone hard for like that 30 seconds, it only took them 6 seconds to get back up to the max VO2. The others could take them 24 seconds. So that's another little tip I would definitely do.
This is looking good for our interval and 3 to 5k races. A few minutes of dynamic stretches as well as a 30-second hard effort will prepare you the most for performance. But that brings us to the all-out efforts for durations under 10 minutes, which includes that fascinating paper I mentioned at the start. But before I dive into the specifics, every video I release is designed to keep you up to date with the latest research to help your running goals. If that interests you and you want to stay in the loop, then hit subscribe and become a Run Smarter scholar. Okay, we have 2 papers to go, and this next one focuses on the same static stretches mentioned in the previous studies, this time 3 sets of 30 seconds each, followed by a 1 mile uphill effort, and noticed an 8% decrease in performance. So static stretches aren't looking so good for short efforts. But this final study put subjects through 3 rounds of testing, each with a different warm-up routine. There would be 1 week between each round, and the order in which these tests were done were randomized. The first had a treadmill warm-up test for 15 minutes, while rounds 2 and 3 had only 10 minutes on the treadmill, but completed 5 minutes of static stretching or dynamic stretching. Each targeted the same muscle groups and were performed over the same duration. All groups then rested for 5 minutes before doing a sub-maximal run for another 5 minutes and then a time to exhaustion test. And check out these results. The dynamic and static group both showed improvements in running economy while also reporting lower effort levels. Since this paper showed the same improvement in both static and dynamic, while others are showing the potential risk of slowing down with static, I'd remove all the risk and just go with dynamic stretches for 15 minutes beforehand. Okay, now you're up to date with the science of warming up, especially before hard efforts like races. But is there anything you can do mid-race to run faster without using more energy? Well, there is. In fact, I share 5 tips, which I haven't really seen anyone else talk about, and you can learn all about them in this video.